Every empire has a moment it begins to die. Not with armies at the gates or traitors in the court, but with a single decision made by the one man who should have known better. Duke Caedric Blackthorne ruled from obsidian towers that split the skyline like broken teeth, commanded wealth that choked entire trade routes into submission, and carried a name that made seasoned generals lower their eyes. He had everything. And on a frozen evening in the great hall of Ravenmere Keep, with 600 witnesses holding their breath, he destroyed it all with 12 words. Stay with this one. Stay until the last word. Because the fall of a man who believed he could own the world is not a story you forget. The snow came sideways that October, driving against the eastern battlements of Ravenmere like the sky itself held a grudge. Caedric stood at the narrow window of his war chamber, watching the white curtain erase the valley below. His reflection stared back from the frosted glass. 41 years old, iron gray threading through black hair he never bothered to cut properly. A jaw that looked like it had been carved for the express purpose of making other men uncomfortable. The scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a gift from a border skirmish he'd won at 19, had long since become part of his authority. People didn't look at the scar and see damage. They saw consequence. Behind him, the war table stretched 12 feet long, covered in maps weighted down with daggers and empty wine cups. The remnants of a strategy session that had ended 3 hours ago when he'd dismissed his commanders with a wave of his hand and a silence that none of them dared question. "You haven't eaten." The voice came from the doorway, steady, unimpressed. Duchess Seraphina Blackthorne leaned against the stone frame with her arms crossed, watching her husband the way a physician watches a patient who refuses treatment. She was 38, built lean from years of riding the duchy's borders herself, when the inspections required a presence that wouldn't be ignored. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a practical knot. No jewels, no paint on her face. She'd stopped performing femininity for the court years ago, around the same time she'd realized the court's opinion of her was irrelevant compared to the opinion of the treasury ledgers she balanced every quarter. "I ate," Caedric said without turning. "You drank. That's not the same thing." "It's close enough." Seraphina crossed the room and set a plate of bread and cold meat on the edge of the war table, pushing aside a map of the southern provinces. She didn't ask permission. She never had. That was the thing about Seraphina that most people misunderstood. They assumed her steadiness was submission. They mistook her refusal to shout for a lack of will. 12 years of marriage had taught Caedric otherwise, though the lesson sat in a part of his brain he rarely visited anymore. "Harmon says the grain shipments from Aldenmere are 3 weeks late," she said, pulling a chair and sitting without invitation. "The river routes are freezing early. If we don't redirect through the mountain passes before the first real storm, we'll be rationing by midwinter." "Then redirect them." "I already did. I'm telling you so you're aware, not so you can approve it." He turned from the window, looked at her. There was a time, early in their marriage, when he'd found that directness thrilling. A woman who didn't flinch. A woman who walked into rooms full of hostile lords and spoke with the calm precision of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome before she opened her mouth. He'd married her for alliance. The Ashford family controlled the northern mining territories, and his father had needed their iron. But he'd kept her because she was useful. More than useful. She was the architecture beneath the surface, the system that kept Ravenmere functioning while he fought wars and expanded borders. But somewhere in the last 2 years, useful had become invisible. Architecture didn't dazzle. Systems didn't make a man feel powerful. They just worked, quietly, the way foundations work. You stopped noticing them until they cracked. "The assembly is in 6 weeks, Seraphina continued. Lord Hargrove sent word that the northern houses want to renegotiate the timber tariffs. I've drafted a counterproposal that gives them a 5% reduction in exchange for extending our exclusive milling rights through the next decade." "Fine." "You didn't hear what I said. Timber, tariffs, 5%, milling rights. I heard you." Seraphina studied him. That look, the one that stripped away the title and the scar and the armies and saw whatever small, restless thing was pacing inside him. He hated that look, not because it was wrong, but because it was never wrong, and a man who needed to believe in his own invulnerability couldn't afford to be seen clearly. "What's going on with you, Caedric?" Nothing is going on with me. You've been absent from 3 council meetings. You snapped at Theron in front of the entire military staff yesterday. And now you're standing in a frozen room drinking wine at noon and staring at snow. I'm the Duke of Ravenmere. I can stare at whatever I want. The words landed flat. Even he heard it. The cheap deflection of a man who didn't want to answer the question because the answer would require a kind of honesty he hadn't practiced in years. Serafina stood, picked up the plate she'd brought, set it down again closer to him. "Eat something," she said, and left. The door closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. Caedric drained the rest of his wine and told himself the restlessness was nothing, a seasonal thing. The weight of administration pressing against a man built for conquest. He'd spent the first decade of his reign expanding the duchy through military campaigns that had tripled its territory. He'd broken rival houses, absorbed their lands, rebuilt their economies under Ravenmere's banner. He was a conqueror, and now there was nothing left to conquer. The borders were secure. The treasury was full. The enemies were either dead or kneeling. Peace should have been the reward. Instead, it felt like a cage. He didn't know it yet, wouldn't know it for months. But this was the precise moment the empire started dying. Not from an external wound, from the internal rot of a man who confused restlessness with destiny. Lady Celestine Voss arrived at Ravenmere Keep on a Tuesday, in a carriage drawn by matched gray horses, wearing a traveling cloak the color of crushed sapphires. She was 26, blonde hair that caught light like it had been specifically engineered to do so, eyes the shade of pale green that poets wasted entire careers trying to describe. She moved through the world with the fluid awareness of a woman who understood exactly what her appearance did to rooms and had long since learned to weaponize it. She'd been appointed as Serafina's new lady-in-waiting, a diplomatic gesture from House Voss, a minor but ambitious family seeking closer ties to the duchy. Serafina had approved the arrangement without much thought. Ladies-in-waiting were political currency, nothing more. You accepted them, put them to work, and used the connection when you needed leverage with their families. Caedric first saw her in the Great Hall during the evening reception. She curtsied. He barely noticed. Serafina introduced her, explained the arrangement, and moved on to the next item of court business. 3 days later, he noticed. It was the garden corridor, mid-afternoon. Celestine was standing by the windows that overlooked the interior courtyard, reading a letter. The winter light hit her at an angle that turned her hair into something architectural. She looked up as he passed, smiled, not the practiced, careful smile of a courtier, something warmer, something that suggested she saw him not as a title, but as a man. "Your Grace." Her voice carried a quality he couldn't name immediately. Later he'd recognize it as performance, but in that moment it registered as sincerity. "I've been reading about the campaigns in Aldenmere, the way you broke the siege. It was extraordinary." "It was war," he said. "Nothing extraordinary about it." "That's exactly what makes it extraordinary. A man who doesn't need to call his victories extraordinary." She tilted her head slightly. "Most powerful men I've met can't stop telling you how powerful they are." "You don't. That's different." He should have walked away. A man with a functioning sense of self-preservation would have recognized the flattery for what it was. A hook, baited and cast with expert precision. But Caedric Blackthorne had been running on empty for months. The restlessness. The invisible wife. The kingdom that functioned so smoothly it no longer needed his hand on the wheel. And here was a woman who looked at him like he was still the conqueror, still the force of nature, still the man who broke sieges and reshaped maps. "What's your name again?" he asked, though he remembered perfectly. "Celestine. Celestine Voss." "Welcome to Ravenmere, Lady Voss." He walked away, but he came back the next day, and the day after. And within 2 weeks, the garden corridor had become a geography of obsession. Theron Greymane, chief military advisor, Caedric's oldest surviving friend, and the only man in Ravenmere who could speak to the Duke without diplomatic padding, noticed first. "You're being stupid," Theron said, standing in the armory while Caedric inspected a new shipment of cavalry lances he had no tactical reason to inspect. "Excuse me?" "The Voss girl. Half the keep is already talking." "Let them talk." "Caedric." Theron stepped closer. He was 53, barrel-chested, with a face that had absorbed so many punches over the decades it had taken on the resigned quality of old leather. I followed you into 17 engagements. I've carried men's bodies out of trenches you ordered dug. I don't scare easy, but what you're doing right now scares me. I'm not doing anything. That's the problem. You're standing at the edge of a cliff and telling yourself the view is nice. Caedric set down the lance, turned. The look on his face, the one that had ended arguments, negotiations, and occasionally lives, landed on Theron with its full weight. Choose your next words very carefully, Caedric said. Theron held the gaze. Your wife holds this duchy together. You know that. I know that. Everyone in this keep knows that, except apparently the one person whose job it is to know it. Whatever the Voss girl is selling, you cannot afford to buy it. Are you finished? Are you listening? Silence. The kind that fills rooms like smoke. Get out, Caedric said quietly. Theron left. He didn't slam the door. That wasn't his style. He closed it with the precise care of a man who understood that the conversation he'd just had would matter later, when everything was ash, and someone needed to say I warned him. The weeks accelerated. Celestine Voss operated with the patience and precision of a siege engineer who understood that the strongest fortresses fall not from bombardment, but from erosion. She never overplayed, never appeared desperate. She asked questions about his campaigns and listened to the answers with an intensity that made him feel like the most important man in any room, which technically he already was, but power had numbed the sensation. She restored it. She also, with the subtlety of someone trained in the architecture of manipulation, began to reframe Serafina. Never directly, never with malice that could be traced. Small observations dropped like seeds into fertile soil. The Duchess is remarkable, truly, though I wonder if she realizes how much the court admires warmth. Competence can be so cold when it's unaccompanied. I noticed Her Grace didn't attend the reception last night. I suppose when you've managed a duchy for so long, social obligations must feel beneath you. You carry so much weight, Your Grace. Does anyone here actually see that? Or do they just hand you problems and expect solutions? Each comment was a needle, precise enough to draw blood without leaving a visible wound. And Caedric, who could read a battlefield from 3 miles away but couldn't read the woman standing 6 inches from him, absorbed every word and let it settle into the architecture of his thinking. Serafina noticed the shift the way engineers notice hairline fractures. Small, almost invisible, but structurally significant. Caedric stopped attending their morning briefings. He began questioning her decisions on trade negotiations he'd previously rubber-stamped. He looked at her differently, or rather, he stopped looking at her altogether. She confronted him in his study on a Thursday evening, the fire burning low, his desk covered in correspondence he hadn't opened. Tell me what's changed, she said. Nothing's changed. Everything's changed, Caedric. You won't look at me. You contradict decisions we made together as though I made them behind your back. 3 of our Eastern commanders have written to me directly because you haven't answered their dispatches in weeks. What is happening? He stood from the desk, poured wine, the familiar escape. Maybe I'm tired of being managed. The word landed like a blade. Managed. Not supported. Not partnered. Managed. Serafina's expression didn't crack, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. The moment a strategist recognizes that the terrain has shifted beneath her and the map she's been reading no longer matches the ground. Is that what you think I've been doing? Managing you? I think this duchy has one ruler, and lately it's been unclear which one of us holds that title. That's never been unclear to anyone except apparently you. Right now, tonight. Careful, Serafina. Or what? She stepped forward. You'll dismiss me the way you've dismissed Theron? The way you've stopped listening to every person in this keep who tells you what you don't want to hear? Who's left, Caedric? Who's still willing to stand in front of you and say the thing you need to hear instead of the thing you want to hear? He said nothing, and his silence told her everything. She searched his face for the man she'd married, the fierce, brilliant, flawed man who had conquered half a continent and trusted her to hold it together. She couldn't find him. In his place stood someone she didn't recognize, harder, emptier, and looking at her like she was a wall between him and something he wanted. "When you're ready to tell me the truth," she said, "I'll be here." She turned and walked out. She would keep that promise for exactly 31 more days. The Great Hall of Ravenmere Keep could hold 600 bodies and amplify a whisper to a roar. It was built for declarations, for the kind of political theater that turned private decisions into public fact. The stone walls were lined with the banners of every house sworn to the duchy, their colors forming a mosaic of loyalty that stretched to the vaulted ceiling. On the evening of the winter investiture, every seat was filled. Lords, commanders, merchants, diplomats, and their retinues packed the hall in their finest garments, the air thick with perfume and ambition, and the low hum of 600 simultaneous calculations about who stood where and what it meant. Caedric entered from the eastern door in full ceremonial armor, the black steel polished to a mirror finish, the Blackthorne crest, a raven clutching a sword, emblazoned across the chest plate in silver. Behind him walked Celestine Voss. Not beside him, not yet, but close enough that the gap between them told a story the entire court could read. Serafina was already seated in the Duchess's chair on the dais. She wore dark emerald, understated, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of a woman who had dressed for a funeral she hadn't yet been told was hers. The ceremony proceeded through its rituals, titles confirmed, oaths renewed, the mechanical formality of feudal governance grinding through its gears. Then Caedric stood. The hall fell silent. Not gradually, instantly, the way sound dies when a predator enters a clearing. "I have an announcement," he said. His voice carried the full weight of the hall's acoustics, and every syllable hit stone and bounced back amplified. "Regarding the future of this house and the governance of this duchy." Serafina's hands tightened in her lap. A movement so small that only someone watching for it would have caught it. Theron, standing at the edge of the military delegation, closed his eyes. "After careful consideration, I have determined that the Duchess Serafina Blackthorne and I shall formally dissolve our union. She will be granted the Ashford estates as settlement and provided appropriate escort to the northern territories." 600 people held their breath. "Additionally," Caedric continued, his voice steady, almost mechanical, as though he was reading from a military order rather than detonating his own household, "Lady Celestine Voss shall assume the role of consort and principal advisor to the duchy, effective immediately." The silence didn't break. It shattered. Into whispers, gasps, the scraping of chairs as people leaned toward each other to confirm they'd heard correctly. On the dais, Serafina sat perfectly still. Her face revealed nothing. 12 years of political training held every muscle in place, while something vast and irreversible collapsed behind her eyes. She stood. The whispers died. She looked at Caedric, not with hatred, not with tears, with the devastating clarity of a woman who finally understood that the man she'd built an empire beside had chosen to burn it down, and there was nothing left to save. "I wish you exactly what you deserve, Your Grace," she said. Then she descended the dais, walked the full length of the great hall with 600 pairs of eyes tracking her every step, and disappeared through the western doors. She did not look back. In the frozen courtyard of Ravenmere Keep, Serafina Blackthorne stood alone beside a single horse and 2 saddlebags containing everything she'd chosen to take from 12 years of marriage. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear and black and merciless, stars scattered across it like shrapnel. A figure appeared at the courtyard gate. Theron Greymane, still in his ceremonial uniform, his breath clouding in the bitter air. "I tried," he said. "I know." "Where will you go?" "North. The mining territories still answer to Ashford blood." "With what army? What resources?" Serafina swung into the saddle, looked down at the man who had been the closest thing to an honest voice in her husband's inner circle. "With what I've always had, Theron. The truth about what holds things together and what tears them apart." She turned the horse toward the gate. The hooves rang against frozen stone like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Theron watched her ride into the darkness until the night swallowed her completely. Then he turned back toward the keep, where the sounds of celebration were already spilling from the great hall. Music and laughter and the bright, brittle noise of a court that had just witnessed the beginning of its own destruction and mistaken it for a party. Inside, Caedric Blackthorne raised a glass to the future with Celestine Voss glittering at his side. He did not know that 300 miles to the east, a sealed letter bearing the crest of House Voss had already been delivered to Lord Aldrich Havenshaw, commander of the rival Eastern Coalition. He did not know that the letter contained detailed maps of Ravenmere's coastal defenses, updated troop rotations, and the names of every commander whose loyalty could be purchased. He did not know that the signature at the bottom of that letter belonged to the woman currently holding his hand and smiling at him as though he were the only man in the world. The Empire was already bleeding. The Duke just couldn't feel it yet. The celebration lasted 3 days. 3 days of music that bounced off Ravenmere's stone walls like something trying to escape. 3 days of wine flowing through the great hall in rivers that stained the oak tables purple. 3 days of courtiers falling over themselves to congratulate Duke Caedric Blackthorne on his bold new beginning, their smiles polished to a shine that concealed every private calculation happening behind their teeth. Celestine Voss presided over it all from the Duchess's chair like she'd been born in it. She wore white silk on the first night, emerald on the second, black velvet on the third. Each gown selected with the precision of a general choosing terrain. The court watched her and adjusted. Those who had been loyal to Serafina quietly recalibrated their allegiances. Those who had always resented Serafina's competence found in Celestine a figure they could flatter without feeling diminished. And those who saw exactly what was happening kept their mouths shut, because in Ravenmere, clarity without power was just another way to get yourself killed. Caedric moved through the festivities with the restless energy of a man who had just won a battle and couldn't understand why the victory felt hollow. He drank. He laughed too loudly. He put his hand on Celestine's waist in public with the performative confidence of someone proving a point to an audience he couldn't name. But late on the third night, when the last of the revelers had stumbled to their quarters, and the great hall sat empty except for guttering candles and the smell of spilled wine, he found himself standing at the window of his war chamber again, staring at snow. The same window. The same posture. The only thing missing was the voice from the doorway telling him he hadn't eaten. He poured wine and told himself the silence was freedom. 6 weeks after the dissolution, the first fracture appeared. Lord Brennan Ashwick, who controlled the fertile river valley southeast of Ravenmere, sent word that his quarterly grain tribute would be delayed indefinitely. The letter was polite, meticulously worded, and underneath its diplomatic surface ran a current of something Caedric hadn't encountered from a vassal lord in over a decade. Defiance. "He's testing you," Theron said, standing across the war table with his arms folded and his face arranged in the particular expression he reserved for situations he'd predicted and been ignored about. Ashwick sent his grain through Serafina's logistics network for the last 8 years. She negotiated the rates. She maintained the relationships with his transport captains. She personally resolved the river dispute that would have bankrupted his eastern farms. You removed her. He's reminding you that the arrangement was with her, not with you. The arrangement is with the duchy. I am the duchy. You're the duke. The duchy is the system that keeps everything moving. Serafina was the system. Caedric looked up from the letter. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees, and it had nothing to do with the weather. You have one function in this keep, Theron. Military council. Stay in your lane. My lane is keeping you alive. Right now, that means telling you things you'd rather set on fire than hear. Then maybe you should stop talking before I take that literally. Theron didn't flinch. 23 years of friendship, if you could call the brutal, honest, frequently adversarial bond between them friendship, had inoculated him against Caedric's threats. He knew the difference between the Duke's genuine killing cold and his defensive bluster. This was bluster, which meant somewhere underneath the armor, the man was scared. Ashwick is the first, Theron said evenly. He won't be the last. The northern mining lords haven't confirmed their winter shipments. The coastal trade guilds are requesting meetings that keep getting postponed because your new consort has replaced the scheduling secretary with her cousin, who apparently thinks diplomatic correspondence is sorted by how pretty the seal looks. Enough. Not even close to enough. But I'll stop, because you're going to find out I'm right on your own, and it's going to cost more than it needed to. Theron turned and left. The door closed with that same careful precision. the sound of a man archiving evidence for a future reckoning. Caedric stood alone in the war chamber and felt something shift in his chest, a hairline crack in the certainty he'd built his entire identity around. He crushed it immediately. Doubt was a luxury for men who didn't rule. He'd spent 41 years constructing a version of himself that moved through the world like a blade, and blades didn't second-guess their own edge. You cut, or you were cut. You dominated, or you were dominated. Every negotiation, every battle, every relationship operated on this axis, and the moment you stepped off it, you became prey. This was not cruelty. This was the arithmetic of survival as he understood it, learned at the knee of a father who had beaten the lesson into him with fists and silence and the perpetual withdrawal of approval. Caedric Blackthorne did not know how to hold things gently because no one had ever held him gently. He only knew how to grip. And when something in his grip stopped feeding the hunger inside him, he let go and grabbed something else. He didn't recognize this as damage. He recognized it as strength. That was the most dangerous part. Celestine came to him that evening with a proposal. She swept into the study carrying a leather folio and wearing an expression of earnest concern, so perfectly calibrated that a less compromised man would have seen the engineering behind it. "I've been reviewing the Duchy's advisory council," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Serafina's chair, though neither of them acknowledged that. "Some of these men have been in their positions for 15 years. Their loyalty is to old systems, old relationships. They're experienced. They're entrenched. There's a difference." She opened the folio. Inside were names neatly listed. Lord Desmond Tully, your trade chancellor. He's been redirecting surplus revenues into a personal account in the southern banking houses for at least 3 years. Serafina may have known. She may have allowed it in exchange for his cooperation on other matters. Caedric's jaw tightened. "Where did you get this?" "I have contacts in the banking houses. My family's business required certain financial relationships." She slid the folio across the desk. The numbers were convincing, detailed. The kind of evidence that took months to compile or minutes to fabricate if you knew what you were doing. "Tully is one of 6, Celestine continued. "I'm not suggesting you purge your entire council, but strategic replacements would strengthen your position. Fresh voices. People who owe their appointments to you, not to legacy arrangements." "People who owe their appointments to you, you mean?" She smiled, open, warm, the smile of a woman who had just been caught and wanted you to know she didn't mind. "To us," she said. "Everything I do is for us." Caedric studied the folio. The evidence against Tully was damning. Whether it was real or manufactured didn't matter as much as it should have, because the seed had been planted. The idea that his existing advisors were compromised, that the infrastructure Serafina had built was riddled with rot, that only a clean sweep could restore his authority. Within a month, he dismissed Tully and 2 other senior advisors. Their replacements were younger, hungrier, and unanimously connected to families that Celestine had cultivated during her brief tenure at court. The new trade chancellor was a man named Gregor Fenn, whose primary qualification was his willingness to approve whatever Celestine suggested without asking questions that might make anyone uncomfortable. The machinery of the duchy didn't break immediately. It stuttered. Decisions that Serafina would have processed in hours now took days. Supply chains that had operated on relationships she'd built over a decade began to fray as unfamiliar hands pulled the levers. Revenue reports started showing inconsistencies that nobody could explain because the people who understood the old systems had been replaced by people who understood only one thing: which direction to face when they wanted approval. 340 miles north, in the iron-gray mining town of Ashford's Reach, Serafina Blackthorne sat at a wooden table in a tavern that smelled like coal dust and cheap ale and conducted the kind of diplomacy that doesn't require a throne room. "The northern routes are frozen solid through March," said Marin Dunwell, a broad-shouldered woman who ran the largest mining cooperative in the region. She'd known Serafina for 9 years, back when the Duchess used to ride the Northern Circuit personally, inspecting mines, mediating disputes between operators, and earning the kind of loyalty that came from showing up when it was cold and miserable and no one expected you to bother. "Your supply agreements are good through spring, but after that, Ravenmere's new administration is going to try to renegotiate. They always do when new people take over. Let them try, Serafina said. The terms are locked under the mining compact I drafted 6 years ago. The compact isn't tied to the duchy's leadership, it's tied to the Ashford family seal. So Caedric can't touch it. He can contest it legally. It would take 2 years in the arbitration courts, and he'd lose. Marin grinned, the slow, satisfied expression of someone watching a chess move they hadn't seen coming. You planned for this. Serafina didn't smile back. I planned for everything. That was my job. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than planning. Serafina hadn't anticipated being discarded. The specific wound still sat in her chest like a shard of glass she'd learned to breathe around rather than remove. But she had built every agreement, every alliance, every trade route with the structural redundancy of someone who understood that systems must survive the people who create them. She'd designed the duchy's economic architecture to withstand war, famine, and political upheaval. She hadn't designed it to withstand its own architect being ripped out at the roots, but she'd come close. In the weeks since her arrival in the north, she'd done what she did best, listened. Not to lords in marble halls, but to miners with broken hands, merchants whose cart axles snapped on frozen roads, border captains who hadn't been paid in 2 months because Ravenmere's new payroll administrator couldn't find the disbursement ledgers Serafina had kept in perfect order for a decade. She listened, and she solved problems, and word spread through the northern territories the way warmth spreads from a fire. Slowly at first, then all at once. People came to her, not because she summoned them, because she was useful. Captain Aldrich Fenn, no relation to the new trade chancellor, though the coincidence of surnames would later prove darkly ironic, commanded the garrison at Northwatch, the fortress that guarded the mountain passes between Ravenmere's territory and the hostile eastern borderlands. He rode into Ashford's Reach on a frozen morning in late November, his horse half dead from the journey and his face carrying the specific expression of a military man who has been asked to do his job without the resources to do it. We're down to 60 men, he told Serafina in the back room of the tavern that had become her unofficial headquarters. I requisitioned reinforcements 3 times. The first 2 requests went unanswered. The third came back with a note saying my garrison had been reclassified as a secondary installation and my troop allocation had been redistributed to the Capital Defense Force. Who signed the reclassification? Someone named Gregor Fenn. Serafina's expression didn't change, but her breathing slowed by half a beat. Fenn is the new trade chancellor. He has no authority over military installations. Apparently he does now. The Duke signed an executive order consolidating administrative oversight under the Chancellor's office. Everything, trade, military logistics, civilian infrastructure, runs through one desk. That desk being Celestine's. Her name isn't on anything, but every order comes from Fenn, and Fenn doesn't exhale without her permission. Serafina stood and walked to the window. The mining town spread below her in shades of gray and black, smoke rising from chimneys in thin columns that the wind shredded before they reached the sky. This was the landscape her family had controlled for generations, hard, unforgiving, and absolutely essential to the duchy's survival. Every sword in Caedric's army was forged from northern iron. Every horseshoe, every siege engine bolt, every nail in every ship, all of it began here, in these mountains, pulled from the earth by people whose names never appeared in court records. She's consolidating, Serafina said quietly. Not to Aldrich, to herself. Working through the architecture of what she was seeing the way she'd always worked through problems, not with emotion but with structure. She removes experienced people and replaces them with dependents. She centralizes authority under a single office she controls through a proxy. She weakens peripheral defenses while strengthening the capital garrison, which means she's either planning to make the capital impregnable or she's making the borders vulnerable on purpose. Why would anyone weaken their own borders? Serafina turned from the window. The look in her eyes had shifted from analysis to something harder, something that had teeth. Because the borders aren't hers to protect, they're hers to sell. The letter arrived at Lord Aldrich Havenshaw's eastern stronghold on a night when the wind howled across the plains like a living thing. Havenshaw, 60 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had spent his youth fighting and his age planning, read it by candlelight in his private study while his advisors slept. The intelligence was extraordinary. Detailed coastal defense schematics showing every weakness in Ravenmere's maritime fortifications, updated patrol schedules for the border garrisons, including the recently reduced Northwatch complement, names and psychological profiles of 17 mid-ranking officers whose loyalty could be leveraged through debt, blackmail, or ambition. The letter bore no signature, but the seal, a small, almost invisible mark pressed into the bottom corner of the parchment, belonged to House Voss. Havenshaw set the letter down and stared at the candle flame for a long time. He was not a reckless man. The Eastern Coalition he commanded had spent 2 decades building strength patiently, avoiding direct confrontation with Ravenmere while Caedric Blackthorne was at the height of his power. But Caedric's power had always rested on 2 pillars: his military ruthlessness and the administrative machinery that kept his war engine funded and supplied. One of those pillars had just walked out the front gate on a single horse. The other was being hollowed out from inside by someone who was apparently willing to hand Havenshaw the blueprints. He called for his war council at dawn. Back at Ravenmere, Caedric woke from a dream he couldn't remember and lay in the darkness of the ducal chambers listening to Celestine breathe beside him. She slept perfectly. No restlessness, no muttering, no involuntary tension, like a woman with absolutely nothing on her conscience. He got up, walked barefoot across cold stone to the window. The city spread below the keep in clusters of torchlight, 10,000 lives carrying on in the darkness, while their duke stood naked at a window, trying to locate the source of an unease he couldn't name. He missed something. Not Serafina. He'd already packed that thought into a compartment and welded it shut. Something else. Something structural. The way a building misses a load-bearing wall. You can't point to the absence. You just feel the floors starting to slope. 3 trade caravans had been raided on the southern route in the past month. The coastal fishing fleet reported that foreign vessels had been spotted inside territorial waters, not attacking, just watching. Lord Ashwick still hadn't sent his grain tribute, and last week, a courier from the eastern border had arrived with a report that troop movements had been observed in coalition territory. Unusual formations, not aggressive, but not defensive either. The posture of an army that was positioning, not yet striking. Any one of these events was manageable. Together, they formed a pattern that Serafina would have identified in an afternoon and responded to by evening. Caedric poured wine from the bedside carafe, drank in the dark, told himself that the duchy had survived worse, that he had survived worse, that control was not something that leaked away. It was something you held through will, and his will had never broken. But will without information is just stubbornness, and stubbornness without awareness is just a man standing in a burning building insisting the temperature is fine. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, not with an army at the gates or a traitor unmasked in the court, but with a number on a piece of paper. Gregor Fenn appeared in Caedric's study with a quarterly treasury report that was 11 pages shorter than usual. The revenues were down 14%. Military expenditures were up 9% despite reduced troop deployments. And there was a line item, a single entry buried on page 6, that allocated 30,000 gold marks to something described as diplomatic consultancy services, with no further explanation. "What is this?" Caedric asked, his finger on the entry. Fenn blinked, swallowed. The mechanical response of a man accessing a prepared answer. Lady Celestine authorized it. Foreign relations expenditures related to maintaining intelligence networks in the eastern territories. Standard practice. I've run this duchy for 17 years. I've never seen this line item before. It's a new initiative. The eastern situation requires updated intelligence. From whom? I don't have those details, Your Grace. Lady Celestine manages the operational specifics. Caedric stared at Fenn until the man's composure began to sweat at the edges. Then he stood, walked to the door, called for a guard. "Find Lady Celestine. Bring her to me." Celestine arrived 20 minutes later, composed as granite, wearing a gray riding dress that suggested she'd just come from the stables, or wanted him to think she had. "The consultancy payments," Caedric said. "No preamble, no warmth. Necessary expenditures. I've been building a network of informants along the eastern border. Havenshaw's been mobilizing, and our existing intelligence apparatus was what? Insufficient. Serafina's people were good at commerce. They weren't equipped for military intelligence. Serafina's people kept this duchy informed for 12 years without a 30,000 mark slush fund. Something flickered behind Celestine's eyes. Fast, controlled. The involuntary response of a predator that just realized the prey was looking directly at it. Times change, she said smoothly. Threats evolve. I'm trying to protect you, Caedric. He watched her. Really watched her, for the first time in months, with eyes unclouded by whatever spell of ego and appetite she'd wrapped around him. She was beautiful. She was calm. She was completely, flawlessly reasonable. And something about that flawlessness, the total absence of crack or hesitation, sent a signal through his instincts that his conscious mind hadn't yet decoded. I want a full accounting, he said. Every payment, every recipient, every piece of intelligence purchased, on my desk by Friday. Of course, Celestine said. She smiled, touched his arm, left. On Friday, the report appeared on his desk. Detailed, comprehensive, perfectly documented. It was also, in every meaningful sense, a work of fiction. But Caedric didn't know that yet. He wouldn't know it until the Winter Sovereigns Assembly, when the truth would detonate in front of every ruling house in the realm and leave him standing in the wreckage of everything he'd refused to see. 200 miles east, Lord Havenshaw finalized his battle plans and sent word to his allies. 300 miles north, Serafina Blackthorne received a visitor she hadn't expected, a young woman in a dust-covered traveling cloak who had ridden 4 days straight from Ravenmere, carrying documents she'd stolen from Gregor Fenn's office at enormous personal risk. My name is Lyra Vane, the woman said, shaking with cold and exhaustion in Serafina's makeshift headquarters. I was a records clerk in the Chancellor's office. I copied everything I could before they changed the locks. Serafina took the documents, opened them, read the first page. Her hands did not tremble. Her face did not change. But her pulse dropped to the slow, heavy rhythm of a woman who has just confirmed her worst suspicion and now understands exactly how bad things are about to get. The documents detailed 18 months of intelligence transfers from Ravenmere to the Eastern Coalition, coastal defense plans, garrison rosters, supply chain vulnerabilities, treasury figures. The name on every authorization was Gregor Fenn's, but the handwriting in the margins, small, precise, unmistakable, belonged to Celestine Voss. Serafina looked up at the trembling clerk. How long until they notice these are missing? 2 days, maybe 3. Then we have 2 days. Serafina stood. Her voice carried the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who had spent 12 years running an empire and had not forgotten a single lesson. Get Captain Fenn. Get Marin Dunwell. Get every border commander who still answers to Ashford blood, and get them here before dawn. The war hadn't started yet. But the woman who would decide its outcome had just been handed the map of every betrayal, and she was not the kind of person who waited for enemies to choose the battlefield. Serafina did not sleep that night. She spread Lyra Vane's stolen documents across the tavern table in Ashford's reach and worked through them the way a field surgeon works through a wound, methodically, without flinching, cutting deeper because the damage demanded it, page after page. Transaction records disguised as diplomatic consultancy fees. Correspondence drafted in Celestine's handwriting, but signed with Fenn's name. Intelligence summaries so detailed that only someone with direct access to the Duke's private war chamber could have compiled them. Coastal defense schematics marked with annotations in a cipher that Serafina recognized immediately. It was a variation of the encoding system she herself had designed for Ravenmere's classified communications, modified just enough to be deniable, but not enough to fool someone who'd built the original. Celestine hadn't just stolen intelligence. She'd hijacked the duchy's own security architecture and turned it inside out. By the time Captain Aldrich Fenn arrived at dawn, Frost still clinging to his cloak and his horse steaming in the courtyard, Serafina had organized 18 months of treason into a sequence so clear it read like a campaign plan. Because that's exactly what it was. Celestine Voss hadn't stumbled into Ravenmere looking for a wealthy husband. She'd been deployed. How bad? Fenn asked, reading her face before she said a word. She's been feeding Havenshaw's coalition everything. coastal fortifications, troop rotations, supply chain timelines, payment schedules for border garrisons, which means they know exactly which commanders are underpaid and vulnerable to recruitment. How long? The earliest document is dated 5 months before she arrived at Ravenmere. She was gathering intelligence on the duchy's administrative structure before she ever set foot in the keep. Fenn sat down heavily. He was a practical man, 46, career military, the kind of officer who survived not through brilliance, but through the relentless refusal to ignore what was directly in front of him. What was directly in front of him now made his stomach turn. She was already working for Havenshaw when Caedric brought her in. She was already working for Havenshaw when she applied to be my lady-in-waiting. The entire approach was manufactured. The appointment, the seduction, the dissolution, all of it. Does the Duke know? The Duke doesn't know what day it is. He's been drinking wine and signing whatever Celestine puts in front of him for months. Marin Dunwell arrived an hour later, followed by 3 border captains and a merchant guild representative named Osric Thane, who controlled the northern river trade. Serafina briefed them in the back room with the door barred and a guard posted outside. She laid out the documents. She explained the scope. She did not editorialize or embellish. She let the evidence speak because the evidence was screaming. When she finished, the room was silent for a long time. "The Winter Sovereign's Assembly is in 11 days, Serafina said. "Every ruling house in the realm will be present. Havenshaw will be there. Celestine will be there. And Caedric will be sitting on the ducal throne with no idea that the woman beside him has been selling his empire out from under him for the better part of 2 years. "So we tell him," Fenn said. "He won't listen. Not to me. Not to anyone who's been associated with me. Celestine has spent months poisoning him against every voice that might contradict her. If I send a messenger, he'll assume it's sabotage from a bitter ex-wife. If one of you goes directly, she'll intercept the communication before it reaches him. She controls the information flow. That's the whole point." "Then what?" Serafina looked at the documents spread across the table. 18 months of betrayal reduced to ink and paper. The architecture of her own destruction, and the duchy's, laid out with the clinical precision of someone who understood systems well enough to dismantle them. "We don't tell him," she said. "We show him. At the assembly. In front of every house in the realm, where Celestine can't suppress it and Caedric can't ignore it." "That's a public execution," Marin said. "That's the only option that works. Private warnings get buried, diplomatic back channels get intercepted. The only court in the realm that Celestine Voss cannot manipulate is a room full of rival lords who have their own intelligence networks and their own reasons to see the truth laid bare. And if it destroys the Duke in the process?" Serafina's jaw tightened. A muscle flexed near her temple, the only outward sign of something vast and complicated moving beneath her surface. She had spent 12 years building an empire beside a man who had repaid her with public humiliation. She had every right to let that empire burn, every justification, every moral license to sit in the north and watch the consequences of Caedric's choices consume him. But the duchy wasn't Caedric. The duchy was 10,000 farmers and miners, and fishermen and soldiers and their families, and they hadn't chosen any of this. "If it destroys him," she said quietly, "then it destroys him. But the duchy survives. That's what matters." The Winter Sovereign's Assembly convened in the grand citadel of Thornhaven, a neutral fortress that had hosted the realm's political gatherings for 3 centuries. The hall was immense, a cathedral of gray stone and iron chandeliers, with tiered galleries rising on 3 sides, and a central floor reserved for the ruling houses. Banners hung from every beam. The air smelled like cold stone, beeswax candles, and the particular metallic tension that fills a room when powerful people gather in one place and pretend to be civil. Caedric arrived with a retinue of 40, Celestine at his side in midnight blue silk, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate coil that caught the chandelier light and threw it back like a weapon. She moved through the preliminary ceremonies with the grace of someone who belonged here, greeting foreign dignitaries, exchanging pleasantries with rival lords, performing the role of ducal consort with a fluency that even her detractors found difficult to fault. Theron Greymane walked 3 paces behind the Duke, watching everything with the flat, cataloging gaze of a man who had survived enough ambushes to recognize the terrain of one. Something felt wrong. The Eastern Coalition delegates were too calm. Lord Havenshaw himself, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, seated in the eastern gallery with the relaxed posture of a man holding a winning hand, had greeted Caedric with a warmth that bordered on generous. That warmth made Theron's skin crawl. "Something's off," Theron said to Caedric during a break between sessions, pulling him aside in the corridor outside the main hall. "You've been saying that for 6 months. And I've been right for 6 months. Havenshaw looks like a man who's already won a war nobody else knows is happening." "Havenshaw is a politician. They always look like that." "Not like this. He's not performing confidence. He's containing satisfaction. There's a difference." Caedric studied Theron's face. The old soldier's instincts had saved his life more times than either of them could count. There had been a period, years really, when Caedric trusted those instincts more than his own. That trust had eroded. Not because Theron had been wrong, but because Theron kept being right about things Caedric didn't want to face. "Keep your eyes open," Caedric said, which was as close to admitting concern as his pride would allow. The Assembly's second day opened with trade negotiations, the routine machinery of inter-house commerce that kept the realm's economy functional. Tariff adjustments, shipping lane disputes, the tedious, essential work that powerful men delegated to their chancellors while they maneuvered behind the scenes. Caedric was reviewing a proposed amendment to the Coastal Fishing Compact when the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Serafina Blackthorne walked in. She wore no finery, dark wool traveling clothes, practical boots, a heavy cloak she hadn't bothered to remove. Her hair was pulled back from her face without ornament. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and walked with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who had calculated every step she would take in this room before she entered it. The hall went quiet. Not the shocked silence of the dissolution announcement. This was different. This was the silence of recognition. Every person in the room understood that something had just changed, even if they didn't yet know what. Caedric's hand stopped on the document he was reading. His fingers pressed flat against the parchment. He didn't look up immediately. He felt her presence the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not through any single sense, but through all of them at once. When he raised his eyes, she was standing in the center of the hall, 30 feet from the ducal platform, looking directly at him. Not at Celestine, at him. "Your Grace," Serafina said. Her voice carried the hall's acoustics perfectly. 12 years of commanding these rooms had taught her exactly how to pitch for maximum reach without raising volume. "I request the Assembly's recognition to present evidence of treason against the Duchy of Ravenmere." The word detonated. Treason. In an assembly hall. Spoken by the former Duchess in front of every ruling house in the realm. Celestine's hand found Caedric's arm, her fingers pressed, a gesture that looked like support and functioned as control. "She's grandstanding," Celestine murmured, her lips barely moving. "A scorned woman making a scene. Don't give her the platform." Caedric didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Serafina, and something in the back of his skull, some ancient pre-verbal survival system that operated beneath thought, was firing signals he couldn't translate but couldn't ignore. Lord Havenshaw, in the eastern gallery, had gone very still. The relaxed satisfaction had drained from his posture like color leaving a face. The Assembly's presiding arbiter, a white-haired neutral lord named Corwin Ashcroft, struck his gavel once. "The former Duchess Blackthorne has standing to address this Assembly under the Charter of Sovereign Testimony. Any citizen of the realm may present evidence of treason before the assembled houses. Your Grace, the floor is hers unless you formally object." Every eye in the hall shifted to Caedric. The decision pressed against him like a physical force. Deny her the floor and he looked afraid of what she might say. Grant it and he risked public humiliation, again, from the woman he'd already discarded once. "Speak," he said. Serafina opened the leather satchel. What followed took 47 minutes. She presented the documents one by one, reading key passages aloud, explaining the accounting structures that had been used to disguise the payments, identifying the cipher system employed in the intelligence transfers, and mapping the timeline of information leaks against specific military setbacks the duchy had suffered over the past year. She was precise. She was devastating. She never raised her voice. She never accused Celestine by name until the evidence had already convicted her. The hall listened in the particular silence that descends when people realize they are watching something that will be discussed for generations. Celestine's mask held for the first 20 minutes. She sat motionless beside Caedric, her face arranged in an expression of patient incredulity, as though she were enduring a performance that would be proven baseless once the adults in the room restored order. At the 25-minute mark, when Seraphina produced a letter in Celestine's handwriting that detailed Ravenmere's coastal defense vulnerabilities and cross-referenced it with a recent incursion by unidentified vessels in those exact locations, the mask began to fracture. A tightness around the eyes, a slight change in breathing, the involuntary tells of a body preparing for flight while the mind still insisted on composure. At the 38-minute mark, when Seraphina laid out the connection between House Voss and the Eastern Coalition, financial records showing Voss family accounts receiving payments from Haven Shaw's treasury dating back 3 years before Celestine's appointment at Ravenmere, Caedric's hands began to shake. He pressed them flat against the armrests of the ducal throne, pressed hard, as though the physical pressure could contain what was building inside him. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. He could see Seraphina's mouth moving, could hear the words landing in the hall like artillery rounds, but his brain was processing them at a delay, each revelation arriving a half-second after its emotional impact, so that he felt the blow before he understood what had struck him. Celestine had been placed. The seduction was engineered. The dissolution was a tactical objective. Every whispered compliment, every strategic reframing of Seraphina as cold and controlling, every casual suggestion that his advisors were compromised, all of it had been a campaign. He was not the conqueror of this story. He was the target. He was the terrain. Something collapsed inside his chest, not his heart. Nothing so clean or dramatic. Something structural. The framework of assumptions that had allowed him to wake up every morning and believe he was in control. The story he'd told himself about who he was. The man who couldn't be manipulated. The duke who saw through every scheme. The conqueror whose will bent the world to his purposes. That story had been a fairy tale. And the woman sitting beside him, whose hand was still on his arm, whose perfume he could still smell, had written the ending before he'd even opened the book. "Your Grace," Seraphina's voice cut through the static in his head. She was looking at him now with something he couldn't classify. Not pity, not triumph, not anger. Something more complicated. Something that looked like the exhaustion of a woman who had been right about everything and would have given anything to be wrong. The evidence demonstrates a systematic campaign of intelligence transfer from the Duchy of Ravenmere to the Eastern Coalition, conducted through intermediaries controlled by Lady Celestine Voss and facilitated by the administrative restructuring she engineered through Chancellor Gregor Fenn. The campaign has been active for approximately 18 months and has compromised the duchy's military readiness, economic stability, and territorial integrity. She paused. The hall held its breath. "I present this evidence not to condemn," she said, "but to prevent the destruction of a duchy that 10,000 people depend on for their survival. What you do with it is your decision." She closed the satchel, stepped back. The hall erupted. Caedric's body moved before his mind caught up. He stood from the throne. The motion was violent, sudden. The chair scraped backward against stone with a sound that cut through the noise like a blade. He turned to Celestine. She was already standing, already calculating. He could see it now. The machinery behind the beautiful face, the rapid processing of options and angles, the predator's assessment of escape routes. He'd mistaken that machinery for warmth, for admiration, for love. He'd mistaken it because he wanted to, because the lie she offered was more flattering than the truth his wife had told him every day for 12 years. "Is it true?" he asked. His voice was low, raw, stripped of the commanding resonance he'd cultivated for decades. He sounded like a man who'd just been hit in the stomach and was still trying to figure out if he could breathe. Celestine's eyes met his, and for 1 second, one single, naked second, the mask came off entirely. What he saw underneath wasn't fear or guilt or remorse, it was contempt. The cold, absolute disdain of someone who had studied a mark for months, found every weakness, exploited every vulnerability, and felt nothing but professional satisfaction at the thoroughness of the work. "You made it so easy," she said. 5 words, delivered with the quiet precision of a scalpel. Caedric's fist hit the arm of the throne hard enough to split his knuckles against the iron. Blood ran across his fingers. He didn't feel it. "Arrest her," he said. The words came out fractured. "Arrest her now." Guards moved. The hall descended into controlled chaos. Celestine Voss was seized by two soldiers who had to physically drag her from the platform because she did not resist. She simply went limp, forcing them to carry her, which meant every person in the gallery watched the beautiful woman in midnight blue silk being hauled away like a body, and the image branded itself into the political memory of the realm. Lord Havenshaw was already gone. His chair in the eastern gallery sat empty. His delegation vanished through a side corridor while the hall's attention was locked on the spectacle at the front. By the time anyone thought to look for him, he was on horseback outside Thornhaven's walls, riding east with an armed escort, carrying in his head every piece of intelligence Celestine had delivered and the certain knowledge that the war he'd been planning now had a deadline. Theron reached Caedric before anyone else. The old soldier took one look at the Duke's face. The blood on his hand, the gray pallor of his skin, the eyes that had gone somewhere deep and dark and unreachable, and did the only thing worth doing. He stood beside him and said nothing. The assembly dissolved into emergency session. Reports poured in within hours, 3 provinces formally declaring independence, citing the duchy's compromised security as justification for self-governance. The Treasury audit that Corwin Ashcroft ordered revealed that Celestine's financial network had siphoned nearly 200,000 gold marks through fabricated consultancy accounts. Border commanders sent word that Eastern Coalition forces were repositioning along the frontier in formations that were no longer ambiguous. They were attack postures. Caedric sat in the chamber assigned to him at Thornhaven and watched his empire dismember itself in real time. Every dispatch was another organ failing, another system shutting down. The border fortresses at Eastmarch and Greyhaven had raised coalition banners. Their commanders, underpaid for months by Fenn's mismanaged logistics, had accepted Havenshaw's gold and switched allegiance. The coastal fleet reported that foreign warships had entered territorial waters and were blockading the southern trade routes. The grain stores that should have lasted through winter were half what the records indicated, because the records had been falsified. Theron entered the chamber near midnight, found Caedric standing by the window in the dark, the dispatches scattered on the floor around his feet. "How many do we have?" Caedric asked. Meaning soldiers, meaning loyal forces, meaning what was left. 4,000, maybe 4,500 if we pull the capital garrison. Havenshaw? 12,000, minimum, plus whatever the defected provinces contribute. The treasury? Functionally empty, enough to supply the army for 6 weeks. After that, we're borrowing or begging. Caedric pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The gesture was involuntary. The physical need to feel something solid when everything internal had turned to liquid. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window. He barely recognized it. The iron jaw, the scar, the face that had made generals lower their eyes. All of it suddenly looked like a costume. A performance he'd been putting on for decades to convince the world, and himself, that the man inside was as strong as the man on the surface. He wasn't. He had never been. The strength had been borrowed from the systems he'd ignored, the people he'd dismissed, the wife he'd thrown away because her competence made him feel unnecessary, and her honesty made him feel seen, and being seen was the one thing Caedric Blackthorne could not tolerate because what was under the armor was not a conqueror. It was a frightened man who had learned at 5 years old that love was conditional and power was the only currency that never depreciated, and he had organized his entire life around that lesson, and the lesson was wrong, and everything it had built was falling apart. "There's one option," Theron said carefully. "You won't like it." "I haven't liked anything in 6 months. Say it." "Serafina." The name landed in the dark room like a stone dropped into still water. "The Northern Territory's answer to her," Theron continued. "Mining cooperatives, frontier garrisons, merchant guilds, border captains. She has resources, manpower, and more importantly, she has the trust of people who won't follow us anymore. She's the only person in the realm who can rebuild the coalition fast enough to counter Havenshaw before spring. She won't help me. Probably not, but she might help the duchy. She always did care more about the duchy than about you. That used to bother you. Right now it might save your life." Caedric turned from the window. In the darkness, Theron couldn't see his face clearly, but he could hear the breathing. The ragged, controlled intake of a man forcing himself to function through the kind of damage that doesn't leave visible marks. "If I go north," Caedric said, "I go as a man who publicly destroyed his wife, gutted his own administration, and handed his empire to an enemy agent because she made him feel like a conqueror again. I go as everything I've spent my life proving I'm not: weak, stupid, beaten. Yes. And I ask the woman I humiliated in front of 600 people to save me. You ask her to save the duchy. That's a different question." "Is it?" Theron let the question hang. Some questions weren't meant to be answered by anyone other than the person asking them. Caedric stood in the darkness for a long time. The dispatches on the floor, the blood dried on his knuckles, the empire hemorrhaging around him like a body that had been opened in too many places to close. He had spent 41 years building a version of himself that never needed help, never admitted fault, never bent. That version had just been revealed as a fiction more elaborate than anything Celestine had manufactured. The man who remained after that fiction collapsed was someone he'd never met. Smaller, rawer, stripped of every defense mechanism and survival strategy he'd accumulated since childhood, standing in the wreckage without armor for the first time, and discovering that the cold was worse than he'd imagined. But the cold was real, and reality, for all its brutality, was the only foundation left that hadn't been built on lies. "Prepare the horses," Caedric said. "We ride at dawn." Theron turned to leave. "Theron." The old soldier stopped. "If she turns me away, if she refuses, I won't blame her." Theron looked at the shape of his duke standing in the darkness and saw something he had never seen before. Not the conqueror, not the warlord, not the man who had broken sieges and remade maps and bent an entire realm to his will. He saw a man standing at the edge of who he had been and staring into the void of who he would need to become, and the distance between those two things was so vast it could swallow a person whole. "She might," Theron said, "but you're going anyway." "I'm going anyway." 300 miles away, in the iron-gray headquarters at Ashford's Reach, Serafina Blackthorne received word that the assembly had detonated exactly as planned. She read the dispatch, set it down, walked to the window that overlooked the mining town she had turned into a command center. Below her, soldiers drilled in the frozen courtyard. Merchant wagons loaded supplies along the northern road. Runners carried messages between captains who had answered her call not because she held a title, but because she had spent 12 years earning something no title could purchase. A knock at the door. Captain Fenn entered. "Havenshaw has mobilized. Full Eastern Army. 12 to 15,000. He's moving west toward Ravenmere. Timeline? 3 weeks. Maybe less if the roads hold." "And Caedric?" "Reports from Thornhaven say he's preparing to ride north." Serafina closed her eyes. 1 breath. 2. The controlled rhythm of a woman who had learned long ago that decisions made in anger are decisions made for your enemies. When she opened them, the woman at the window was not the discarded wife, was not the grieving partner, was not the victim of a public humiliation that still burned in a place she'd learned to seal off like a contaminated room. She was the architect of the only infrastructure still standing between 10,000 civilians and an invading army, and the man who had torn that infrastructure apart was riding toward her asking for help, and the fate of every miner, farmer, soldier, and child in the duchy depended on what she did next. She turned from the window. Her face carried the weight of a choice no one should have to make: save the empire that betrayed her, or let it fall and call it justice. "Prepare the war council," she said, "and clear a room in the east wing." "For whom?" Serafina looked at Captain Fenn with eyes that held 12 years of love and loss and labor, compressed into something harder than the iron pulled from these mountains. "For the Duke. He's going to need somewhere to sit when I tell him exactly how bad this is." Caedric Blackthorne rode into Ashford's Reach on the 4th morning, half frozen, trailing 6 soldiers and Theron Greymane on a horse that had gone lame 12 miles south of the mining town. The Duke's ceremonial armor was gone. He wore field leathers and a wool cloak caked with ice and mud. and his face carried the hollowed-out look of a man who had spent 4 days on horseback with nothing for company except the systematic dismantling of everything he'd believed about himself. The town watched him arrive. Miners paused at their cart tracks. Merchants stood in doorways. Children stared from behind frozen water barrels. Nobody bowed. Nobody averted their eyes. These were northern people, Ashford people, and the man riding through their streets was the Duke who had thrown away the woman they respected. Deference was not on the menu. Serafina met him in the tavern's back room. Not the courtyard, not the front entrance, not any space that might suggest ceremony or welcome. The back room, where the table was still covered in military maps and the air smelled like coal smoke and cold iron. She was standing when he entered, arms at her sides. No defensive posture, no aggressive one, just standing. Occupying space with the absolute stillness of someone who had already decided how this conversation would go and was waiting for the other participant to catch up. Caedric stopped 3 feet inside the door. Theron stayed in the corridor. The door closed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was structural, load-bearing, holding up the weight of 12 years of partnership and 6 months of wreckage. Caedric looked at his former wife and saw her clearly for the first time since the garden corridor, since Celestine, since the night he'd demolished his own household in front of 600 witnesses. Serafina looked harder, leaner. The softness that court life maintains, even in strong women, had been stripped away by weeks of field command and brutal weather. What remained was iron and competence, and something behind her eyes that he recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors for decades. The specific exhaustion of carrying an empire on your spine and knowing that putting it down means people die. "You look like hell," she said. "I've earned it." "Yes, you have." Another silence. This one sharper. He felt the cut, but didn't flinch from it. Flinching was a luxury for men who still had defenses to protect, and his had been burned to the ground at Thornhaven. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said. "Good, because I'm not offering it. I'm here because Havenshaw has 15,000 soldiers marching toward Ravenmere, and I have 4,000, and the only person who can close that gap is standing in this room. So this is a military negotiation. This is me standing in front of the person I wrong most and telling her the truth, which is that I cannot save the duchy alone. I destroyed the systems that held it together. I replaced competence with flattery. I threw away the only alliance that mattered because a woman with a pretty face told me what I wanted to hear, and I was too arrogant and too broken to recognize the difference between admiration and manipulation." Serafina's expression didn't change, but her breathing shifted, a slight deepening, the involuntary response of a body absorbing an impact it hadn't fully braced for. She'd expected him to come with demands, commands, the imperious certainty that had defined him for 2 decades. She had not expected this, a man standing in the ruins of his own mythology and describing the wreckage without attempting to rebuild the lie. "The duchy isn't yours to save anymore, Caedric." "I know. The people in this town, the soldiers drilling in that courtyard, the captains who rode 3 days through frozen mountains to answer my call. They're not here for you. They're here because I asked, because I showed up when you didn't, because I remembered their names and fixed their roads and made sure their children had iron for plows when the harvest failed." "I know." "Then what exactly are you offering?" He reached for the familiar machinery, the commanding voice, the strategic calculus, the transactional framework that had governed every relationship he'd ever had. It was gone, stripped clean. What came out instead was something raw and unprocessed, pulled from a depth he hadn't known existed. "My sword, my soldiers, my knowledge of Havenshaw's tactical patterns from 20 years of border engagements, and my body between your people and the enemy's army, which is the only currency I have left that's worth anything." Serafina studied him the way she'd studied military maps for 12 years, looking for weaknesses, false positions, traps hidden beneath obvious terrain. She found none. The man in front of her was not performing contrition. He was reporting a status, damaged, depleted, stripped to the frame, with the brutal honesty of a field commander delivering a casualty count. She pulled out a chair, sat down, gestured to the maps. "Sit," she said. We have 11 days before Havenshaw reaches the capital. Here's what I need from you. They worked through the night. Serafina laid out the strategic situation with the clinical precision Caedric remembered from 1,000 morning briefings he'd stopped attending because her competence made him feel superfluous. Havenshaw's forces, 12 to 15,000, were advancing along 3 routes toward Ravenmere. The coalition's strategy was straightforward: overwhelm the weakened capital defenses, seize the keep, and install a puppet administration that would transform the duchy into a coalition vassal state. Ravenmere's remaining loyal forces numbered approximately 4,500. Serafina's northern network could contribute another 3,000: miners, frontier soldiers, merchant guards, and clan warriors from the mountain territories who had answered her mobilization call. Total, 7,500 against 15,000. "We can't win a pitched battle," Serafina said. "The numbers don't work. Havenshaw knows that. He's counting on us to either surrender or line up in a field and get slaughtered." "So we don't give him a field." Caedric leaned over the map. His finger traced the approach routes to Ravenmere. 3 valleys converging on the coastal plain where the capital sat. Each valley was narrow enough to limit Havenshaw's numerical advantage if properly defended, but holding all 3 simultaneously with 7,500 troops was impossible. "We hold one," Caedric said, "Grey March Pass. It's the shortest route and the one his main force will use. The valley narrows to half a mile at the ridgeline. 1,400 men could hold it against 5 times their number if the flanks are anchored. And the other 2 routes? We don't hold them. We collapse them." Serafina looked up. "The bridges at Thornford and Westcut, and the road supports through the Ashworth Gorge. If we bring down the mountain road, his southern column adds 6 weeks to their march. If we destroy the Thornford Bridge, his northern column is stuck on the wrong side of the river until spring. That cuts off our own retreat if Grey March fails. There is no retreat. We hold Grey March or we lose the duchy. That's the math." Serafina held his gaze. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, not just tactical, but human, weighing the lives that would be spent against the lives that would be saved, running the arithmetic of sacrifice that commanders carry like a second heartbeat. "You're talking about trapping our own forces," she said. "If we collapse those routes and Havenshaw breaks through Grey March, there's nowhere to go." "Havenshaw won't break through Grey March. Not if I'm standing in it." The words weren't bravado. They were delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had already accepted a specific outcome and was simply informing the relevant parties. Caedric Blackthorne had spent his entire life fighting to possess territory, power, control, the admiration of others. For the first time, he was prepared to fight for something without possessing it, to stand in a gap and hold it. Not because holding it would make him a conqueror, but because the people behind him deserved someone between them and what was coming. He didn't recognize this as transformation. He recognized it as the only option left after everything else had been stripped away. Sometimes a man doesn't become better through wisdom. He becomes better because the machinery of selfishness finally runs out of fuel. The next 8 days were a controlled hurricane of preparation. Serafina coordinated the logistical nightmare of mobilizing a fragmented defensive force across 300 miles of frozen territory. Supply caches were established along the route to Grey March. Medical stations were positioned in the valley behind the pass. Communication relays were set up using the mining town's existing signal network, a system Serafina had built years ago for coordinating ore shipments that now served as a military command infrastructure. Caedric worked with Theron and Captain Fenn to prepare the pass itself. They arrived at Grey March 5 days before Havenshaw's estimated arrival and found exactly what the maps promised: a valley that narrowed to half a mile between 2 granite ridgelines, with a frozen river running through the center and dense forest climbing both flanks. The position was strong but not impregnable. Havenshaw would probe the flanks, test the forest cover, look for ways to get soldiers above the ridgeline and attack from elevation. "We need the trees," Caedric said, standing on the ridgeline in a wind that cut through his cloak like it was made of paper. "If Havenshaw gets archers into those tree lines, he pins us in the valley and grinds us down." "We fell them," Theron said. "Create a kill zone. Open ground on both flanks for 200 yards. Anything that moves into that space is visible and targetable." "That's 3 days of cutting with every able body we have." "Then we'd better start." They felled trees for 72 hours straight. Soldiers worked in shifts alongside miners who handled axes the way most men handled eating utensils. Naturally, without thought, the muscle memory of a lifetime. Serafina's logistics network kept food, water, and medical supplies flowing to the work crews while simultaneously managing the destruction of the Thornford Bridge and the collapse of the Ashworth Gorge Road. The bridge went down on day 3. Marin Dunwell personally supervised the demolition, using mining charges placed with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much force it took to break stone. The bridge, a 300-year-old stone arch that had carried trade between the northern and southern territories for generations, collapsed into the frozen river in a cascade of granite and ice that could be heard 5 miles away. The Gorge Road followed on day 4. A series of controlled detonations brought the mountainside down across the narrow passage, burying the road under 40 feet of rock and earth. Havenshaw's southern column, 4,000 soldiers who had been making excellent time through the gorge, found their route buried under a mountain and their commander staring at a wall of rubble that would take months to clear. Havenshaw, receiving the reports at his mobile headquarters, adjusted. He was not a fool. He understood that the bridge and gorge destructions were designed to funnel his forces into Greymarch, and he understood that Greymarch was being prepared as a killing ground. But he also understood mathematics. Even concentrated into a single approach, his remaining force of 11,000 outnumbered the defenders by a significant margin. Quality could compensate for geography, but only to a point. Eventually, numbers told. He pushed his main column toward Greymarch at forced march speed. On the morning of the 9th day, Caedric stood on the ridgeline above the pass and watched the horizon fill with soldiers. They came from the east like a dark tide, infantry columns stretching back along the valley road for 2 miles, cavalry units flanking on the cleared ground, siege equipment dragged on ox-drawn carts that groaned under the weight. Banners from 6 allied houses rippled in the frozen wind. The Eastern Coalition had come in force, and the sight of 11,000 armed soldiers advancing toward a pass held by 7,500 was the kind of visual that separated the men who fought from the men who ran. Caedric's heart hammered against his ribs. Not with fear. He'd processed fear so many times over 20 years of combat that the emotion had been compressed into something dense and functional, a fuel source rather than a paralytic. What hammered was something else. Awareness. The hyperclarity that descends on a human body when it understands that the next few hours will determine whether it continues to exist. Colors became sharper. Sounds separated into individual components. The creak of leather, the clink of chainmail, the breathing of the man standing next to him. Time decelerated. Each second stretched to accommodate the enormous amount of information his senses were trying to process. He descended the ridgeline to the defensive line. 1,400 men stood in the narrowest section of the pass, arranged in a formation Theron had designed around the terrain. 3 ranks deep, heavy infantry at the center, archers on elevated positions along both ridgelines, cavalry reserves positioned behind the main line for counterattack if the enemy broke through. Serafina was at the command post, 200 yards behind the front line, managing communications with the flanking positions and the reserve forces in the valley beyond. She'd insisted on being present despite Caedric's objection, which she'd dismissed with a single sentence. "I didn't rebuild this coalition to watch it fight from a tavern." Caedric walked the line, not inspecting, connecting. He looked at the faces of the men and women who would hold this pass. Miners with axes, frontier soldiers with battered shields, merchant guards who had signed up for escort duty and found themselves standing in a mountain gap, waiting for 11,000 enemies to arrive. Their faces showed what faces always show before battle. Not courage, not fear, but the strange compressed calm of people who have passed through panic and come out the other side into a place where everything is very simple and very clear. "Nobody here owes me anything," Caedric said. His voice carried across the line, roughened by cold and 4 days of minimal sleep. "I know that. You're not here because I asked. You're here because she asked. Because the woman I was too stupid and too proud to value built something with you that's worth defending. I'm not going to stand here and give you a speech about glory. There's no glory in this. There's just a line in the dirt and people on both sides of it, and the ones behind us can't fight for themselves. That's it. That's the whole thing." He drew his sword. The steel caught the gray winter light and threw it back dull and cold. I'm going to stand in the front rank, not because I'm brave, because it's the only honest place left for me to be. He took his position, front rank, center, the place where the first wave would hit hardest. Theron materialized beside him. The old soldier didn't say a word, just drew his blade and stood at Caedric's right shoulder, the way he'd stood in 17 engagements over 23 years. Some loyalties don't require explanation. They just show up when the dying starts. Havenshaw's forces reached the mouth of the pass at midday. The advance halted. Scouts probed the flanks, found the cleared kill zones, reported back. Havenshaw studied the terrain from a command position on the eastern ridge and made his calculations. The pass was narrow but not impossible. The defenders were dug in but outnumbered. His archers couldn't find elevated positions because the tree lines had been felled, but massed archer fire from the valley floor would suppress the ridgeline positions eventually. He sent the first wave at noon. 3,000 infantry advanced into the pass in a formation designed to absorb casualties at the front while maintaining pressure from the rear. The sound of their approach was a wall of noise, boots on frozen ground, shields clashing into formation, the rhythmic shout of officers keeping pace and order. The ground trembled. Caedric watched them come. His sword hand was steady. His breathing had settled into the deep, slow rhythm of a body conserving energy for the explosive demand that was seconds away. The space between heartbeats stretched wide enough to think in, and what he thought was not about victory or survival or redemption. He thought about the miners behind him who had families in Ashford's reach, about the merchant guards who would never see their trade routes again, about the frontier soldiers who had ridden through blizzards to stand in a gap for a duchess they respected. He thought about Serafina, 200 yards behind him, running the war he'd made necessary. The first wave hit the line like a hammer striking an anvil. The impact was physical, a wall of shields and bodies crashing into a wall of shields and bodies, the sound somewhere between a thunderclap and the breaking of wooden ships. Men screamed. Steel shrieked against steel. The front rank absorbed the collision and held, barely, boots sliding on frozen ground as the pressure of 3,000 attackers compressed against 1,400 defenders. Caedric killed the first man who came at him with a thrust through the gap between shield and helmet. The second he took with a lateral cut that opened the man's sword arm at the elbow. The third got close enough to slam a shield boss into Caedric's ribs before Theron's blade found the man's throat. The fighting was close. Brutal. The kind of combat that strips away everything except animal function. Swing, block, step, breathe, swing again. Caedric's world compressed to a 6-foot radius of violence. Blood sprayed across his face. His own. A cut above his right eye that bled freely into his vision. Someone else's. A spray from a wound he'd inflicted that he couldn't remember inflicting because the sequence of strikes had become autonomous, his body operating on 20 years of combat training while his conscious mind floated somewhere above, watching, processing, making small adjustments to angle and timing that meant the difference between living and dying. The first wave broke after 40 minutes. Havenshaw's infantry pulled back, leaving bodies in the narrow pass like driftwood after a flood. The defenders held. Barely. Casualties were heavy. Nearly 200 down, a mix of dead and wounded that Serafina's medical teams dragged behind the lines with the desperate efficiency of people who knew the next wave was coming. Caedric stood in the aftermath, chest heaving, blood running from 3 separate cuts he couldn't feel yet. The adrenaline was a wall between him and pain, and behind that wall the damage was accumulating like debt. Cracked ribs from the shield impact, a deep laceration on his left forearm, the eye cut that kept bleeding no matter how many times he wiped it. Second wave forming, Theron said beside him. The old soldier was bleeding from a wound on his scalp that had painted half his face red. He didn't seem to notice. Heavier this time. He's committing cavalry on the right flank. The kill zone will slow them. Slow, not stop. Caedric looked at the eastern ridge where Havenshaw's command position was visible as a cluster of banners. The coalition general was patient, methodical. He would grind the pass defenders down wave by wave, accepting casualties at a rate he could afford because his reserves were deep enough to absorb the cost. It was the arithmetic of attrition, and the numbers were on his side. Unless the numbers changed. "Where's Serafina?" Caedric asked. Command post. She's been running the signal relays. Get me a messenger. A runner appeared. Caedric grabbed the young man's shoulder and spoke directly into his ear, cutting through the noise of the reforming enemy lines. Tell the Duchess that Havenshaw is committing everything to the frontal assault. His rear guard is thinned. If Marin Dunwell's mining crews can come through the Eastern Gorge Trail, the goat path above the tree line, they can hit his supply train from behind while his main force is engaged in the pass. The goat path is barely passable in summer, my lord. In winter, Marin's miners have been climbing these mountains since before they could walk. They'll make it. Go! The runner went. Caedric turned back to face the second wave, already advancing, heavier this time, armored infantry in the center, cavalry probing the right flank across the open kill zone, where felled trees had created a field of stumps and frozen mud. The second assault hit harder than the first. Havenshaw had adjusted. His infantry came in staggered waves that maintained constant pressure, preventing the defenders from resetting between surges. The cavalry on the right flank took casualties crossing the kill zone, but reached the defensive line in sufficient numbers to create a secondary crisis that pulled reserves away from the center. Caedric fought in the center. The world had narrowed to the simplest possible equation: hold the line or lose everything. His body was a machine of accumulated damage, each wound adding its voice to a chorus of pain that his mind acknowledged and filed away because there was no time and no point in doing anything else. A sword strike opened his left shoulder, a shield edge caught his jaw, and he felt something crack. Blood from the eye wound mixed with sweat and ran into his mouth, copper and salt. He kept fighting. Not because he was strong, because stopping meant the people behind him died. And somewhere in the wreckage of who he used to be, that equation had become the only thing that mattered. The man who had spent 41 years fighting to possess had discovered in the worst possible classroom that fighting to protect felt different in ways he couldn't articulate. It hurt more. It cost more. And it made sense in a way that conquest never had, because conquest was about filling an emptiness inside yourself, and protection was about standing between that emptiness and the people who shouldn't have to pay for it. The second wave broke at dusk. Both sides staggered apart in the failing light, the pass floor covered in bodies and blood, and the detritus of close combat. Broken shields, shattered sword blades, torn standards trampled into frozen mud. Caedric collapsed against a rock behind the line. His breathing came in ragged, wet sounds that Theron recognized as cracked ribs puncturing the tissue around the lungs. Not a killing wound. Not yet. But the kind of damage that turned fatal without rest. And rest was not available. Third wave at dawn, Theron said, sliding down beside him. The old soldier looked worse than Caedric. The scalp wound had been joined by a deep cut on his sword arm that someone had wrapped with a strip of cloth already soaked through. He'll throw everything. Break us or starve us. Marin? No word. The night settled over Grey March Pass like a burial shroud. Fires burned on both sides of the line. The defenders huddled around theirs for warmth, eating what rations Seraphina's supply network had positioned, tending wounds with materials that were already running short. The enemy fires stretched across the valley floor in a constellation of orange points that numbered the thousands. Seraphina came to the front line at midnight. She moved through the wounded, checking supplies, speaking to soldiers in the low, steady voice that had become the sound of reliability itself throughout the northern territories. When she reached Caedric, she knelt beside him and looked at his injuries with the assessment of someone who had spent enough years managing military logistics to know the difference between wounds that fought and wounds that killed. The ribs, she said. They'll hold. They won't. You need binding, proper binding, not whatever you've been using. She called for a field surgeon, watched as the man wrapped Caedric's torso in tight linen, each pass of the bandage pulling a sound from Caedric's throat that he tried to suppress and couldn't. When the surgeon finished, Seraphina dismissed him and sat on the frozen ground beside her former husband. They didn't speak for a long time. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the loaded, accusatory silence of the tavern in Ashford's Reach. It was the silence of two people who had run out of pretense and found that what remained, while damaged, was at least honest. Marin will come, Seraphina said finally. You're sure? She climbed Mount Ashford in a blizzard when she was 16 to prove her father wrong about women working the high mines. She'll make the goat path. And if she doesn't, then we hold the pass anyway. Because there's nothing behind us except the people we're protecting, and they're not negotiable. Caedric looked at her. Firelight played across her face, the lean, weathered, undecorated face of a woman who had never needed silk or jewels or the admiring gaze of courts to know her own worth. He had thrown this away. He had looked at this face and seen architecture instead of beauty, competence instead of devotion, partnership instead of passion. He had been so catastrophically, irreversibly wrong that the magnitude of it sat in his chest like a second set of broken ribs. Serafina, don't. Her voice was quiet, firm. Whatever you're about to say, don't. Not tonight, not in the middle of this. If we survive tomorrow, you can say whatever you need to say. But right now I need you functional, not emotional. He almost smiled. Almost. The familiar precision of her pragmatism, the quality he'd once called coldness because he didn't have the vocabulary to call it strength. At dawn, he said. Front rank, center. I know, that's where you belong. She stood, looked down at him one last time, then walked back toward the command post, her boots crunching on frozen ground, her shadow stretching long in the firelight. Dawn came gray and merciless, the sky the color of old steel, the wind carrying the first flakes of a storm that was building in the mountains to the north. Havenshaw's army assembled in the valley with the organized efficiency of a force that smelled blood. The third wave would be the last. Everything committed, reserves emptied, the full weight of 11,000 soldiers aimed at a pass held by men and women who had been fighting for 2 days on broken sleep and dwindling supplies. Caedric stood in the front rank. His ribs screamed. His left arm functioned at half capacity. The eye wound had closed, but the swelling reduced his vision on the right side. He gripped his sword and felt the familiar weight, and understood with absolute clarity that this was probably the last time he would hold it. The thought did not produce fear. It produced something simpler, a settling. The way a building settles into its foundation when the last stone is placed. He was standing exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he should have been doing his entire life, instead of conquering and possessing and consuming. Standing between danger and the people who mattered, not because it would make him powerful, because it would make him useful. Havenshaw's full army began to move. The ground shook. The sound was oceanic, a roaring wall of human noise that filled the valley and bounced off the granite ridgelines and crashed over the defenders like a physical wave. And then, from the eastern ridge behind Havenshaw's position, a horn sounded. Not a military horn, a mining horn. The deep, resonant blast that echoed through mountain shafts when crews signaled between levels. A sound that every miner in the Northern Territories recognized the way they recognized their own heartbeat. Marin Dunwell's 300 miners came over the eastern ridge like an avalanche of iron and fury, crashing into Havenshaw's unprotected supply train and rear guard with the wild, unstoppable momentum of people who had spent their lives breaking rock and found that breaking soldiers was significantly easier. Havenshaw's formation shuddered. The rear ranks turned to face the new threat. Officers screamed conflicting orders. The disciplined advance toward Grey March Pass stuttered, then stalled, then fractured as the army tried to fight in two directions simultaneously. Now, Caedric said. One word. Quiet enough that only Theron heard it, and the front rank surged forward into the chaos. The front rank hit Havenshaw's disoriented vanguard, like a fist driven into an open wound. Caedric led the surge with his sword already moving, his broken ribs compressing against the linen bindings with every stride, paint detonating through his torso in white bursts that his body processed and dismissed because the body has its own priorities when survival narrows to the width of a blade. The pass became a crucible. Havenshaw's army, caught between Marin Dunwell's miners tearing through the supply train from behind, and the defenders surging forward from the front, lost the one thing that separates an army from a mob: coordination. Officers screamed orders that contradicted other officers' orders. Cavalry units wheeled in confusion, horses slipping on frozen ground slicked with blood. Infantry formations that had held discipline through 2 days of organized assault collapsed into clusters of men fighting for individual survival rather than collective objective. Caedric fought through the chaos with the mechanical precision of a body that had been trained for this across 2 decades and no longer required conscious direction. His vision had tunneled to the immediate, the next sword, the next shield, the next 3 feet of ground. He took a spear thrust to the left thigh that punched through leather and muscle and lodged against bone. He broke the shaft, left the head embedded, kept moving. Blood filled his boot. The leg functioned. That was enough. Theron went down 40 minutes into the surge, a mace strike to the shoulder that Caedric heard rather than saw, the wet, structural sound of bone giving way under impact. The old soldier dropped to one knee, his sword arm hanging useless, and looked up at Caedric with an expression that contained no surprise. 23 years of combat had taught Theron that everyone's body eventually fails. The only question was timing. "Get him behind the line!" Caedric shouted at 2 soldiers nearby. They grabbed Theron under the arms and dragged him backward through the press of bodies. The old soldier didn't protest. He'd spent his currency. He knew it. Caedric filled the gap Theron left and kept fighting. The battle turned on a moment so small that no chronicler would ever identify it precisely. Somewhere in the eastern rear, Marin Dunwell's miners reached Havenshaw's command position. The coalition general, 60 years old, silver-haired, brilliant at the strategic level, but physically removed from combat for the better part of a decade, found himself facing 3 women with mining axes who did not care about his rank, his reputation, or his carefully constructed battle plans. His personal guard held for approximately 4 minutes before being overwhelmed by sheer ferocity and the particular advantage that miners possess in close combat, which is that they have spent their lives swinging heavy tools in confined spaces and have forearms like bridge cables. Havenshaw was captured, not killed. Marin had received explicit instructions from Serafina on that point. A dead enemy general becomes a martyr. A living one becomes a bargaining chip. When word of Havenshaw's capture spread through the coalition ranks, the collapse was rapid and total. Unit commanders began ordering surrenders. Soldiers threw down weapons and raised empty hands. The roar of combat that had filled Greymarch Pass for 3 days diminished to scattered skirmishes, then to the groans of the wounded, then to a silence so profound that the sound of wind through the bare ridgeline trees became the loudest thing in the valley. Caedric stood in the center of the pass, swaying. His sword hung from a hand that had locked around the grip so tightly during the fighting that the muscles had cramped into a permanent fist. Blood covered him, his own and others, layered and drying in patterns that made him look like something dragged out of the earth rather than something that walked on it. The spearhead in his thigh sent pain through his leg in rhythmic pulses that synchronized with his heartbeat, and each pulse carried a message his body was trying to deliver. Stop. Sit down. You're done. He didn't sit. He stood in the wreckage and the silence and the gray winter light and looked at the pass he'd held. Bodies covered the valley floor, hundreds of them, men who had been alive that morning, who had eaten breakfast and checked their weapons and thought about whatever men think about before battles, families, debts, the taste of something they'd never eat again. They were gone now, reduced to the terrible stillness that combat leaves behind, and Caedric stood among them and felt the weight of every single one. This was not glory. This was cost. He had spent his entire life believing that victory justified its price because the alternative was defeat, and defeat was unacceptable. Standing in Greymarch Pass, bleeding from wounds he'd lost count of, surrounded by the dead he'd helped create, he understood for the first time that victory and defeat were both fictions imposed on chaos by men who needed the world to have a scoreboard. The truth was simpler and worse. People fought. People died. The survivors carried the dead forward in their bones and their nightmares, and the only thing that separated a good leader from a bad one was whether the dying had been necessary. This dying had been necessary. Havenshaw would have consumed the duchy. The people behind this pass would have been subjugated, their lives and labor absorbed into a coalition that treated human beings as resources to be extracted. The line in the dirt had mattered, but necessity didn't erase the cost. It just made the cost bearable. Barely. Serafina reached the front line 20 minutes after the fighting stopped. She moved through the aftermath with the controlled efficiency of someone who had managed crises for 12 years and understood that the hour after a battle is more important than the battle itself. Wounded need triage. Surrendered enemies need processing. Supply lines need redirection from combat support to recovery operations. She gave orders, dispatched runners, organized medical teams with the same precision she'd once used to organize trade convoys. She found Caedric still standing in the pass, still holding his sword, still swaying with the mechanical persistence of a man whose body had forgotten how to stop. "Sit down," she said. "I can't. Your leg is—" "I know what my leg is. If I sit down, I'm not getting back up." "That's the point. The battle is over, Caedric. Sit down." He looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with bruise-colored exhaustion, and somewhere behind the physical damage there was something else. A rawness that had nothing to do with wounds. The expression of a man who had been stripped to his foundations and discovered that the foundations were different from what he'd built on top of them. He sat. The motion was graceless, controlled only by Serafina's hand on his arm guiding him to a rock at the edge of the pass. The moment his weight left his legs, the spear wound in his thigh opened fully, and blood pulsed through the torn leather in a rhythm that the field surgeon who arrived 90 seconds later described as concerning but manageable. They extracted the spearhead. Caedric made a sound he'd never made before. Not a scream, not a groan, something between the two that came from a place deeper than pain. Serafina held his hand through the extraction. She didn't speak, didn't offer comfort, just held on, her grip matching his, pressure for pressure, the silent language of two people who had been through enough together that words were no longer the primary channel. The surgeon packed the wound, bound his ribs properly for the first time in 3 days, stitched the cuts on his face and arm with the quick, rough efficiency of a man who had 50 more patients waiting. When he moved on, Caedric sat on the rock with his hand still in Serafina's, staring at the pass, watching the aftermath organize itself into the grim machinery of recovery. "Theron?" he asked. "Shoulder is shattered. He'll live. He won't swing a sword again. He'll hate that. He'll adapt. He always does." "Havenshaw?" "Captured. Marin's holding him in the supply camp. He's been cooperative. He's smart enough to know that cooperation is the only card he has left." Caedric nodded. The motion sent pain through his neck and jaw where the shield edge had cracked something during the second day of fighting. "How many did we lose?" Serafina was quiet for a moment. The hesitation wasn't uncertainty, Sa. She knew the numbers. The hesitation was the weight of saying them aloud. 612 confirmed dead. Another 300 wounded, maybe a third of those critical. Havenshaw lost approximately 2,000 killed, 4,000 wounded, and the rest surrendered. 612. Each number a person. Each person a life that had existed in full complexity, memories, habits, the particular way they laughed or held a cup or fell asleep, now reduced to account on a casualty report. Caedric closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, the dead arranged themselves in rows that stretched beyond what his imagination could render. He had ordered men to their deaths before, dozens of times. It had never felt like this. It had never carried this specific gravity, because before the dead had been instruments of his ambition, soldiers expended in the service of expansion, numbers on the ledger of conquest. Now they were people who had died defending their homes because their duke had been too blind and too vain to prevent the war that killed them. "I did this," he said, not as a confession, as an accounting, the simple, brutal mathematics of cause and effect. "You didn't do this alone." "No, but it started with me. Every piece of intelligence Celestine sold, every defense she compromised, every commander she corrupted. All of it happened because I opened the door and invited her in and handed her the keys because she told me I was extraordinary." Serafina released his hand, not in anger, in the careful, deliberate way of a woman who understood that some truths need to stand on their own without being cushioned by contact. "Yes," she said. "It started with you." He opened his eyes, looked at her. The honesty in her face was the same honesty that had terrified him for years, the refusal to soften, to cushion, to tell him what he wanted to hear instead of what was true. He'd called that coldness. He'd called it management. He'd called it everything except what it actually was, which was respect. She had respected him enough to be honest, and he had punished her for it because honesty required him to see himself clearly, And what was visible beneath the armor and the titles and the conquered territories was a frightened man who had never learned to hold anything without crushing it. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we go back to Ravenmere. We secure the duchy. We rebuild what was broken. And you make a decision about what kind of man you want to be for however many years you have left." The march back to Ravenmere took 9 days. Caedric rode in a wagon for the first 4 because his leg wouldn't support a saddle. He lay on his back and watched the winter sky scroll overhead, and felt each bump in the road transmit through his wounds like a telegraph message from his body to his brain, each pulse carrying the same content. You are alive and it hurts, and both of those things are more than you deserve. They entered the capital on a gray morning in late February. The city showed the scars of the crisis. Markets half empty, buildings damaged during the panic that had swept through when word of the coalition advance reached the population, streets quieter than they should have been because a significant portion of the civilian population had fled north during the worst of it. Ravenmere Keep itself stood intact but diminished, its obsidian towers still splitting the skyline, but the banners that had once lined its walls hanging torn and faded, the visual vocabulary of authority degraded by months of neglect. The Great Hall, the same hall where Caedric had dissolved his marriage in front of 600 witnesses, hosted the assembly that would determine the duchy's future. The room was less full than it had been that night. Many of the lords who had attended the dissolution were dead, fled, or had declared independence during the crisis. Those who remained sat in clusters, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people who had survived something catastrophic and were still calculating whether they'd survived it permanently. Caedric entered from the eastern door. He wore no ceremonial armor, no Blackthorne crest, simple dark clothing, his wounds visible beneath minimal bandaging, his body moving with the careful, deliberate gait of a man managing significant pain without assistance. He had refused help walking, not from pride. The old pride had been burned out of him at Greymarch, from necessity. What he was about to do required him to stand on his own feet, unsupported, because the gesture would be meaningless if it looked like someone else was holding him up. Serafina was already seated, not in the Duchess's chair on the dais. She'd taken a seat in the front row of the assembly floor, among the lords and commanders and civilian representatives. The dais was empty. The ducal throne sat unoccupied, its iron frame casting a shadow across the stone floor that looked like a cage. Caedric walked to the center of the hall, stopped, turned to face the assembly. The silence was different from the dissolution night. Not shocked, not anticipatory. Heavy. The silence of people who had been through a war and understood that what happened next would determine whether it had been worth surviving. "I built this duchy through conquest," Caedric said. His voice had changed. The commanding resonance was gone, replaced by something rougher and more human. The voice of a man speaking from his actual chest rather than performing from a stage. "I expanded its borders through force. I broke rival houses and absorbed their lands and called it progress. I believed that the measure of a ruler was the territory he controlled and the enemies he defeated. I believed that power was the ability to impose your will on the world and the people in it." He paused. The silence held. "I was wrong. About all of it." He looked at the faces watching him. Lords who had feared him, commanders who had followed him, merchants who had profited from his wars, and civilians who had paid for them. Each face was a mirror, and what he saw reflected back was not the conqueror he'd spent 41 years performing. It was the actual man. Smaller than the performance, damaged in ways the performance had been designed to conceal, and standing here anyway, without the armor, letting them see. "The woman I discarded saved this duchy. The advisors I dismissed were the ones telling me the truth. The systems I dismantled were the systems keeping everything alive. I replaced wisdom with vanity. I replaced partnership with possession. I replaced loyalty with flattery, and it nearly destroyed every person in this room and every family they represent." He turned to look at the empty throne on the dais. The iron seat where generations of Blackthorne dukes had ruled, the symbol of everything he'd built his identity around. "I am not fit to sit in that chair. I know that. Everyone in this room knows that. The question isn't whether I should continue to rule. The question is who should." He turned back to the assembly, found Serafina's face in the front row. She was watching him with the same unreadable expression she'd worn in the tavern at Ashford's Reach. Not hostile, not sympathetic. evaluating, the way she evaluated everything, with precision and without sentiment. Duchess Serafina Blackthorne held this duchy together when I was tearing it apart. She built the alliances that saved our borders. She organized the defense that broke Havenshaw's army. She did it without a title, without resources, without a single person in this room asking her to. She did it because the duchy mattered to her more than the man who ran it. His voice cracked on the last sentence. Not dramatically, just a small fracture in the controlled delivery, the involuntary sound of a man encountering an emotion too large to process smoothly. He cleared his throat and continued. I formally surrender all authority, titles, and claims of the Blackthorne Duchy. I ask this assembly to recognize Serafina Ashford as sole and rightful ruler of Ravenmere, with full ducal authority, effective immediately. The hall absorbed the statement the way stone absorbs water, slowly, through every available surface. Then, from the back row, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Then the sound spread through the assembly like a wave, not the explosive celebration of the dissolution night, but something deeper. The measured, deliberate applause of people acknowledging an act that cost something real. Serafina stood. The applause faded. She walked to the center of the hall, stood facing Caedric, 3 feet between them. The same distance as the tavern, the same silence. But everything inside it had changed. I accept, she said, on one condition. Name it. You don't disappear. You don't exile yourself to some remote estate and drink yourself to death and call it penance. This duchy needs rebuilding, villages destroyed, roads broken, families displaced. You know every mile of this territory because you conquered it. Now you're going to walk it again, and this time you're going to fix what's broken. Not because I'm ordering you to, because it's the only way you'll learn the difference between ruling a place and being responsible for it. Caedric held her gaze. The offer was not mercy. It was something harder than mercy. A demand that he live with what he'd done, visibly, publicly, without the escape hatch of exile or the dramatic finality of self-destruction. She was asking him to stay in the world he'd damaged and repair it with his hands, one village at a time, one road at a time, carrying the weight of his failures not as punishment but as education. Yes, he said. The assembly ratified Serafina's ascension by unanimous decree. The surviving lords, many of whom had witnessed both the dissolution and the war and understood the full arc of what had happened, voted without hesitation. Duchess Serafina of Ravenmere. The title settled onto her the way tools settle into the hands of someone who has been doing the work long before receiving the official equipment. Theron Greymane, his shoulder bound and his arm immobilized, stood in the back of the hall and watched the ceremony with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 23 years trying to tell his best friend the truth and had finally, catastrophically, expensively been heard. In the weeks that followed, Serafina moved through the work of governance with the same relentless efficiency she'd always brought. Trade routes were reopened. The treasury was audited, restructured, and placed under a transparency council that included merchant representatives and civilian overseers. Border defenses were rebuilt, this time with garrison commanders who reported directly to the ducal office rather than through intermediaries. Havenshaw was tried, convicted of conspiracy, and sentenced to permanent exile. Stripped of titles, lands, and the coalition he'd built, sent east with nothing but a horse and the knowledge that the empire he'd tried to steal had chosen a better leader. Celestine Voss was tried separately. The evidence Serafina had presented at the assembly was supplemented by additional documents recovered from Fenn's office and testimony from Lyra Vane, the records clerk whose courage had set the entire unmasking in motion. Celestine was convicted of treason, espionage, and conspiracy against the duchy. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in the northern fortress of Coldridge, an irony not lost on anyone, given that Coldridge sat in the heart of the Ashford mining territories, the region Serafina controlled most completely. On the day Celestine was escorted north, Caedric watched the prison wagon leave from a window in the keep. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not feel vengeance. He felt the specific hollowness of a man observing the physical removal of the worst mistake he'd ever made and understanding that the mistake's departure didn't undo the damage. The damage was permanent. It lived in the 612 names on the Grey March casualty list, in the empty chairs at tables across 3 provinces, In the trust he'd broken with a woman who had given him 12 years of partnership and received public humiliation in return. He left Ravenmere 2 weeks after Serafina's installation. Not in a carriage, not with an escort. On a single horse, carrying tools and supplies, riding toward the first of the villages destroyed during the coalition advance. He'd asked for a list. Serafina had given him one. 47 villages. Some damaged, some burned entirely. Thousands of displaced families. Start with Thornford, Serafina said, handing him the list in her study. The same study where he'd once sat behind the desk and dismissed her counsel. She sat behind that desk now. It looked right. The bridge destruction displaced the entire town. They need temporary housing before spring. I'll handle it. I know you will. She looked at him across the desk. The distance between them was not the cold distance of the dissolution or the charged distance of the tavern or the brutal distance of the battlefield. It was the quiet distance of two people who understood each other completely and had accepted that understanding didn't require proximity. What had existed between them? The partnership, the trust, the specific intimacy of two people who had built something enormous together, had been broken in a way that couldn't be reassembled into its original shape. Some fractures heal. Some fractures change the structure permanently, and the new shape, while functional, is not the old shape, and pretending otherwise dishonors both. Serafina. Yes. I'm not going to say I'm sorry, not because I'm not, because sorry is a word, and words are what got me into this. I said words to Celestine that I should have said to you. I listened to words from her that I should have recognized as weapons. I used words to dissolve our marriage in front of 600 people when I should have used them to tell you that I was drowning and didn't know how to ask for help. He stood, straightened, the ribs protested, the leg protested, everything protested. He bore it. So instead of words, I'm going to go build houses and fix roads and sit with people who lost everything because of my blindness and do whatever they need done. And maybe in 10 years or 20 years or however long it takes, the things I build will weigh more than the things I destroyed. Maybe they won't. But it's the only honest currency I have left. Serafina watched him from behind the desk. Her face held an expression he'd never seen on her before. Or maybe he'd never been capable of seeing it before. Not love, not forgiveness, not anger. Recognition. The look of a woman seeing for the first time the man her husband could have been if he'd found his way to this place without burning everything down first. Go build your houses, Caedric, she said. He left. The years that followed became their own kind of story. Quieter, less dramatic, but no less significant. Duchess Serafina's rule transformed Ravenmere from a duchy built on conquest into one built on infrastructure. Trade flourished. The northern mining territories, always the economic backbone, were integrated fully into the duchy's governance with representation and profit sharing that ensured the miners who pulled iron from the earth benefited from the swords that iron became. Borders stabilized not through military intimidation, but through trade agreements that made war economically irrational. The Transparency Council became a model that other houses studied and replicated. Theron Greymane retired from military service and accepted a position as Serafina's chief strategic advisor, a role that required his brain rather than his sword arm, and suited him better than he'd expected. He could occasionally be found in the keep's gardens, teaching young officers the principles of defensive positioning using flower beds and gravel paths as terrain models, his shattered shoulder a permanent reminder of the cost of the lessons he taught. Marin Dunwell was appointed to the newly created position of Northern Territories Governor, overseeing the mining cooperatives with the same ferocious competence she'd brought to climbing mountains and leading 300 miners over a frozen goat path to save a duchy. She never let anyone forget that last part. It became the story she told at every banquet, every council meeting, every occasion that called for a reminder of what ordinary people could accomplish when someone worth following asked them to. Lyra Vane, the records clerk who had stolen the documents that exposed Celestine's treason, was offered a position in the Ducal Intelligence Office. She accepted. She became, over the following years, the architect of an information security system so thorough that no subsequent attempt at infiltration survived longer than 72 hours before being detected and neutralized. She never became famous. She didn't want to be. She wanted the system to work. It worked. and Caedric Blackthorne rebuilt villages. He started at Thornford, where the bridge destruction had displaced 400 families. He arrived alone, set up a tent on the riverbank, and began hauling timber the next morning. The townspeople watched him with suspicion for the first week, hostility for the second, and grudging acknowledgement by the third. When it became apparent that the former duke was not performing charity for an audience, but actually knew how to frame a wall and didn't stop working when his hands bled, he moved from village to village over the months and years that followed. 47 villages on Serafina's list. He completed them all. Some took weeks, some took months. In each one, he lived among the people, ate what they ate, slept where they pointed, and worked from dawn until his body refused to continue. He didn't announce himself, didn't invoke his former title. The people knew who he was. The scar made him unmistakable. But over time, the man they saw bearing planks and digging foundations and sitting quietly at community tables bore so little resemblance to the duke, they remembered that the identity became almost irrelevant. He never returned to Ravenmere Keep, not because he was forbidden, because the keep belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed, and returning would have been a form of pretending. He and Serafina exchanged letters. Infrequent, practical. She reported on the duchy's progress. He reported on the villages. The letters were brief and unadorned, stripped of the emotional complexity that lived beneath them, because both of them understood that some truths are too large for paper and too important to be cheapened by insufficient language. They never reunited as husband and wife. The word never carried a specific weight between them, not the weight of impossibility, but of choice. What they'd had was real. What he'd done to it was real. And the honest response to that reality was not to pretend it could be rebuilt, but to acknowledge that some structures once demolished leave foundations that serve better as memorials than as building sites. On a spring evening 7 years after Grey March, Caedric sat on the porch of a house he'd built in a village called Mill Haven, watching the sun go down over fields that had been burned during the war and now grew barley. His body was 50 years old and carried the accumulated damage of 20 years of combat and 7 years of manual labor. The limp was permanent. The ribs never healed cleanly, and on cold mornings his hands locked up so badly he had to work them open finger by finger before he could grip a tool. A rider appeared on the road. A courier from Ravenmere, carrying a letter bearing Serafina's seal. He opened it, read it in the fading light. The duchy had been invited to host the next Winter Sovereigns' Assembly. The first time in a generation that Ravenmere had been chosen. A recognition by the other ruling houses that the duchy had not only survived its crisis, but emerged as the realm's most stable and prosperous territory. Serafina was writing to inform him, not to invite him. The distinction mattered. Caedric folded the letter, set it on the porch railing. Watched the last light drain from the sky and the first stars appear in the darkness like small, cold truths that had been there all along, waiting for the daylight to stop obscuring them. He had spent the first half of his life building an empire through force, and the second half rebuilding villages with his hands. And the paradox that sat at the center of that arc was not lost on him. The man who had commanded armies couldn't command his own appetites. The conqueror who had reshaped maps couldn't reshape the damage he'd done to the one person who mattered. The duke who had believed that power was the ability to take had learned too late and at too high a cost that power was the ability to let go. But too late was still something. Too late meant the lesson had landed. Too late meant the villages were built, the roads were fixed, the families were sheltered. Too late meant that the 612 names on the Grey March casualty list had not died for a man who refused to change. They had died for a man who changed afterward, and while that sequence was backward and wrong and would never be adequate, it was the only truth available. He sat on the porch until the stars filled the sky. Then he went inside, sharpened his tools for the morning, and slept the dreamless sleep of a man who had finally stopped running from himself and discovered that the stillness, while painful, was the first honest thing he'd felt in 40 years. 300 miles west, in the obsidian towers of Ravenmere Keep, Duchess Serafina stood at the window of her study and looked out over a duchy that was thriving. The markets were full, the borders were quiet. The treasury was stable. The people, her people, in a way they had never been Caedric's, went about their lives with the ordinary confidence of citizens who trusted their government to function. She thought about the man in the eastern villages, not with love, not with anger, not with the complicated tangle of emotions that had defined their relationship for 2 decades, with clarity. The same clarity she'd carried into the Great Hall the night she'd presented the evidence, the same clarity she'd carried into Greymarch, the same clarity that had built a duchy from the wreckage of one man's ego and the loyalty of 10,000 people who deserved better than they'd gotten. Some empires are built by conquerors and inherited by architects. The conquerors get the stories. The architects get the results. Serafina turned from the window, sat down at her desk, and went back to work. This is a work of fiction created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional and bear no relation to any real person, institution, or historical event.